A suspect in the killing of health insurance boss Brian Thompson has appeared in a Pennsylvania courtroom after being arrested in the state on Monday. This was the moment 26-year-old Luigi Mangione arrived in Blair County Courthouse in Hollidaysburg. What a fantastic name for a place. That's in Pennsylvania, where he was charged with possession of an unlicensed firearm. Just hours later, prosecutors in New York City, where Thompson was killed last week, charged Mangione with murder. New York City Police Commissioner Jessica Titch gave this account of the arrest.
The suspect was in a McDonald's and was recognized by an employee who then called local police. Responding officers questioned the suspect, who was acting suspiciously and was carrying multiple fraudulent IDs as well as a U.S. passport. Upon further investigation, officers recovered a firearm on his person as well as a suppressor, both consistent with the weapon used in the murder. They also recovered clothing, including a mask consistent with those worn by our wanted individual. Also recovered was a fraudulent New Jersey ID, matching the ID our suspect used to check into his New York City hostel before the shooting incident. Additionally, officers recovered a handwritten document that speaks to both his motivation and mindset.
According to officials, that document was a manifesto, and one police officer describes it as displaying, quote, ill will towards corporate America. The New York Times also has this detail on its contents. They say a handwritten manifesto found with Mr. Mangione on Monday mentions United Healthcare by name. Of course, the murdered man was the CEO of United Healthcare. They say the note noted the size of the company and how much money it makes, and also broadly condemned healthcare companies for placing profits over care. And that's according to a senior law enforcement official who saw the document. And the official quoted it as saying, these parasites had it coming, and, quote, I do apologize for any strife and trauma, but it had to be done. Investigators also revealed last week that the bullets that killed the CEO were engraved with the words defend, deny, and depose, reportedly a reference to the tactics used by American health insurance firms to avoid paying out for clients' medical treatments. According to the American Association of Retired Persons, private health insurers turn down around 200 million claims each year in the United States, including for life-saving treatments. That's around 15% of all claims, and many are rejected on spurious grounds. Now, that may explain why the killer of the private health insurance boss has received massive amounts of online praise, with many hailing the murderer as a hero. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro wanted to address that praise following Mangione's arrest in his state.
Violence can never be used to address political differences or to address a substantive difference or to try and prove some ideological point. That is not what we do in a civilized society. That was true in Butler. It was true in New York City. It's true anywhere. That is not how you make progress in this country. The suspect here who shot at that CEO and killed that CEO is a coward, not a hero. And we need to make sure that in this country, we get back to having a civil discourse about our differences.
I agree, right? I mean, we're going to talk about this sort of later in the show, but I don't think we should support political violence. I don't think we should support assassinating anyone for political purposes. I do always find it, I suppose, unconvincing the way politicians always rush to call people who commit acts of political violence cowards, right? Because I think to venerate people who carry out, who do sort of political assassinations, which this seems to have been, would be very dangerous. That's not the kind of precedent we want to set. But, if of all the things one could say for the man who killed this healthcare CEO, obviously the man charged is Luigi Mangione, I don't know if coward would be the most sort of appropriate descriptor. Whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't seem like a particularly cowardly thing to do. But we always hear this after a sort of terrorist attack. They call them cowards. Now, I think they're often wrong and immoral. Just cowardly seems, I find it unconvincing. I wonder if sort of others in the audience and people listening to the politicians might feel the same. You heard there Shapiro mention Butler. That was a reference to the attempted assassination of Donald Trump back in July. Of course, a situation where, a number of people seem to be turning to political violence. That is kind of worrying, right? Let's look at Luigi Mangione in a bit more detail. He was born to a prominent Maryland family, and his relatives own country clubs, healthcare facilities, and real estate companies. So from a wealthy family. And Mangione attended the private Gilman Boys School in Baltimore at a cost of around $50,000 per year, before going on to the Ivy League University of Pennsylvania, where he studied computer science. A kind of an odd position to be a kind of class warrior against CEOs. In 2022, Mangione moved to Hawaii, where he joined a co-living community called Surf Break. This was one of his former housemates speaking to CNN.
When I first interviewed him before he moved in, I remember he said he had a back issue and he was hoping to get stronger in Hawaii. So he's always focused on trying. When he first came, he went on a surf lesson with other members. And unfortunately, just a basic surf lesson, he was in bed for about a week. We had to get a different bed for him that was more firm. And I know it was really traumatic and difficult. When you're in your early 20s and you can't, do some basic things, it can be really, really difficult.
Mangione's back issues seem to have been quite severe. So this spinal X-ray image appears on the background of Mangione's Twitter account. So it's in the header. Now, we don't know whether it's his spine, but a surgeon told NBC it probably showed a hardware fusion used in the treatment of the painful condition spondylolisthesis, where a spinal vertebrate moves out of place. In a handwritten note also online, Mangione appears to confirm he suffered from this condition. Another former housemate of Mangione told NBC this. Mangione lived at Surf Break from January 2022 until April of that year. It was our understanding that he left due to a lifelong back injury that was exacerbated by surfing and hiking. To our knowledge, nearly all members of Surf Break from his tenure lost contact after he left. To our knowledge, he did return to Hawaii briefly in early 2023 and started a book club. Several members left due to discomfort in book choices. Now that's an interesting little tidbit there, because a clue to what those book choices might have been can be found on what appears to be Mangione's Goodreads page. So there he seems to have reviewed a book written by Fyodor John Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. Now, Kaczynski killed 3 people and injured 28 more across the US in a series of mail bomb attacks. This is what Mangione wrote about industrial society and its future, which was Kaczynski's manifesto. So he said this under a review. So he gives it 4 stars, so not a full 5, but a reasonable review. And he says, it's easy to quickly and thoughtlessly write this off as the manifesto of a lunatic in order to avoid facing some of the uncomfortable problems it identifies. But it's simply impossible to ignore how prescient many of its predictions about modern society turned out. He was a violent individual, rightfully imprisoned, who maimed innocent people. While these actions tend to be characterized as those of a crazy Luddite, however, they are more accurately seen as those of an extreme political revolutionary. Mangione approvingly cites another review of the book that says this. So he says he had the balls to recognize that peaceful protest had gotten us absolutely nowhere. And at the end of the day, he's probably right. Oil barons haven't listened to any environmentalists, but they feared him. When all other forms of communications fail, violence is necessary to survive. You may not like his methods, but to see things from his perspective, it's not terrorism, it's war and revolution. Fossil fuel companies actively suppress anything that stands in their way, and within a generation or two, it will begin costing human lives by greater and greater magnitudes until the earth is just a flaming ball. And then he sort of says violence against those who lead us to such destruction is justified as self-defense. If that is Mangione's account, then he'd hardly be the first person to endorse some of Kaczynski's positions, if not his methods, of course. And when Kaczynski died last year, Elon Musk replied to a post with this. So it's a post with a quote from Kaczynski. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. So Fyodor Kaczynski was someone who's quite critical of technology. Elon Musk says he might not be wrong. And interestingly, Mangione also appears to have been a Musk fan, having read books about him. That's according to his what looks like his Goodreads page. And a look at Mangione's Twitter account seems to show he may have shared the political views of Musk and other Silicon Valley billionaires. Many of his retweets lament wokeism, with some bemoaning diversity, equity, and inclusion. He also showed an interest in declining birth rates in countries like Japan, as well as in new technologies like lab-grown meat. Lots of these things I'm kind of interested in, but don't read too much into that. Of course, none of that seems related to the crime he's alleged to have committed. According to Mangione's statement in the Pennsylvania court, he had recently broken off all contact with his family and friends, apparently following his spinal surgery, and his mother reported him missing to police just 3 weeks before the shooting took place in New York. Now, it's a fascinating story. This idea that you can sort of, after a potential killer gets named, you can just scroll through their Twitter page, their social media, their Goodreads accounts. It all feels very, unique to our sort of current political and technological moment. However, much of the American public seems fixated on a topic somewhat more base, namely Mangione's abs. This is another of the images on Mangione's Twitter profile. It speaks for itself, really. I don't need to add any comment. Since his identification in the press, Mangione's Twitter has proved a massive hit. Actually, I don't know if it's because of the pictures or because of the tweets, but overnight he's gone from a few hundred to 320,000 followers. Twitter Trending also had a story that sort of made me chuckle a bit this morning. It lamented healthcare CEO's killer charged, public focuses on suspects' looks. Kieran, interesting. This isn't the first story we've done in the last month or so about a sort of surprisingly, well, not surprising, why would it be surprising? A particularly attractive fugitive. But this one does seem to have sort of captured the imagination of many Americans in a way which, I don't think what Josh Shapiro said is ridiculous, right? I think political violence isn't something that should be normalized. At the same time, I do think there are sort of people within the American establishment who are going to be, a bit perturbed that this is the response to, an attack on a health insurance CEO. And that I suppose does speak to something about the healthcare system in the United States.
It's a puzzle. I mean, I've been, first of all, listening to everything you said about him and his position, some of which, I didn't know. He's clearly a very confused person, right? He's a confused person. That's the first thing I think it's important to say. This has, and I think you could almost, I found the reaction to all of this more interesting, I think, than what will ultimately prove to be the killer's motive, because it's functioned almost like a Rorschach test or something like that. A Rorschach test, for those who don't know, just a psychological test in which people were asked to interpret ink blots. And then the psychologist makes interpretations on the participants on the basis of how they interpret those ink blots. Now, I don't know if there's any real basis to it scientifically, but it's a widely held test. The way that people have reacted to this really says something very often about, I've found it to say a lot about their positions. Leftists have interpreted what he did as a left-wing act, or did initially. Libertarians, perhaps more so, whatever it is that they would interpret. And yet still others, it's been a really, really interesting set of reactions to behold. I think the most important thing in all of this, to cut through all of the first traps and the Twitter trolling and, the memes and so on, the thing that I think is interesting, really genuinely interesting in all of this politically, is this question of political violence. But underpinning that, I think, is the way that it's drawn to the fore the question of structural violence. But the question of structural violence, in this case, the structural violence of the US private healthcare system, which is obviously extremely well documented outside of the United States and within the United States. It's there's less need for it to be documented because people have to face it very directly in their day-to-day lives. And I think there is a very serious point among all of this about that structural violence. And that conversation's always going on, but I think it has pushed it right to the top of the agenda.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. He does seem confused. I mean, his political positions don't seem that inconsistent with each other and with his actions. I mean, his political positions seem, from his Twitter, it's the kind of politics that's very popular in Silicon Valley, sort of like kind of very interested in sort of tech people. It's similar to Elon Musk. Elon Musk is interested in wokeness, declining birth rates. What was the other one? Sort of technological meat, lab grown meat, that kind of stuff. He's sort of on that sort of wavelength, plus really annoyed at healthcare executives. Now, I suppose it's interesting because he doesn't seem like an anti-capitalist. He was very sort of in favor of Elon Musk and stuff. So it must be a sort of specific critique of healthcare CEOs or how the healthcare system works in the United States. I mean, the court case will be interesting.